So good evening again. Do appreciate the chance to speak to you this evening. And we are going to be in the book of Genesis. Like I said, we're going to be in chapter 11. Going to be looking at verses 10 through 32 down through the end of the chapter. And what we'll be looking at is we're going to be looking at basically the lineage of Shem, from Shem to Abram. And if I mess up and say Abraham, it's the same guy, right? So we all know that. But occasionally I'm going to do that. But yeah, more lineage. I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but I actually had some help with something here that I wasn't expecting, but it's pretty cool. And I think this makes at least this first little part of it a little more interesting. I have this little chart here that actually Pat shared with me. It's based on the lifespans of these folks we read about in Genesis. Can you see those okay? I don't know if they're huge, but it starts with Adam at the top, and then it comes down to all the way down to Abraham at the bottom. So some of these people, of course, we've already talked about and studied about, but then actually really, I think if I remember correctly, in chapter 10, we even have already come down to Abram in Shem's lineage, but we're going back through this for a reason. There's a purpose to this. And I just thought there were some interesting things to note on this chart as well. If you think about the effects that your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, if you were blessed to know them, might have had on you in your life, just maybe being able to speak to your grandparents and listen to them and hear some of the things they've gone through and different things. That's the kind of thing I want us to kind of think about here. And that may sound odd at first, but I think it'll make sense. If you'll notice, Adam in his lifetime could have known everybody down to Noah. Now, not Noah. Noah just missed, am I right? Or no, no. I think Noah just missed knowing Adam and Enoch. He was just a tad too late. But Adam could have known and interacted with all these people up to Noah. Remember, there's a very small amount of people on the earth too. So it's quite probable. It's not necessarily stated that happened, but definitely he interacted with his son, probably his grandson. But he lived so long and they had such long lives, all these people could have known and interacted with each other. So, like I said, Noah just missed being able to know Adam and Enoch, but Noah's dad, Lamech, would have known all those people, or could have known all those people back to Adam, and could have interacted with them. So again, the population was much smaller. Remember too that they were all really staying fairly close together until the incident we just looked at, the Tower of Babel, which that kind of changed that. But up until then, when you come down to Peleg, do you see Peleg down here? He's down here towards the bottom, right below that red F. And that's when the Tower of Babel occurred, and that's when everybody was divided. And his name means division, if you remember, and if you don't, that's okay. I'll tell you again. So anyway, when we look at this, Shem could have known Methuselah, but probably did not know any of those earlier men. But he could have known Methuselah, Shem being Noah's son, and he's the one we're going to be looking at. But if we look at Shem's line after the flood, and here I zoomed in on this bottom part to try to make it a little better. So I hope that's a little better for you. So Noah and Shem could have known and interacted with everybody on this chart, down to Abram. Could have. I'm not saying they did, but I'm saying the population was small. Depending on where they were at the time, they could have known each other at least somewhat. Let's see. So Abram could have known, or may have known, Noah and Shem. Isaac could have known Shem, but not Noah. He came a little too late for that. And matter of fact, he would have missed out on possibly some of these other folks too. But just that I was thinking, just think of all the experience that we lose because our lifespans are so much shorter. They had these long lifespans. They were able to know generations of their family, just huge generations, right? Because these are all family. Remember, this is the line from Adam down to Abram. This is family. That's their family. But our lifespans are so short, we're lucky to know our great-grandparents, and like I never knew any of mine. All I knew was 3 of my grandparents, which actually 3 out of 4 is not bad because some people don't even know that many. I mean, that's the way this life is. It's short. And you'll notice here, did I mention this here? You'll notice here too, starting with Shem on down. Shem is the blue one that says 600 and on down. You'll see that their lives are significantly shorter after the flood. This goes with, let me see if I can say this right. It goes with the idea or the theory that the earth changed significantly and perhaps impacted people's lifespan. Now, also, there's the fact that the curse is in play and God has said that our lives would be shorter. So let's not take that out of the equation. But I'm just saying that it could go along with that theory. It does not prove that theory in any way, but it could be a part of proof of that the earth went through such a significant change that's part of how our lifespans were shortened. Again, doesn't prove it, but it's just a thought. Now, also in the middle of the chart, remember Peleg, the division that we mentioned? He was named for that dividing there at the Tower of Babel. Now, assuming it happened right before or right around his birth, which would make the most sense to me, then Noah and Shem, and all those down to Peleg would have experienced that dividing. Even if all they saw was God scattering some people away, which I'm assuming he used his divine power to kind of what we would think of as teleport people to places. I'm just going to assume that. I can't, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but he scattered people. He did it himself. However he did that, that's fine. But the only thing I'm familiar with, the only way I know to communicate that is like to say teleport, but there may be other ways. What translate, some people have said, I think, for moving people, translate, but I always think of that as language now. Anyway, so whether they just witnessed the idea or witnessed people being moved, or whether they were actually moved themselves, we don't necessarily know, but they would have seen God's judgment and his mercy because, like we said last time, I mean, God could have done way worse than just scatter people around the world, right? But he didn't. He was merciful. So they would have seen this. They would have known this. Now, Abram, his father and grandfather, would probably not have experienced it from, I'm just trying to, keep the bars lined up and everything. And they would have, it looks like they would have been too late to have experienced that. However, they should have definitely had it told to them, right? This would be a big event that if you experienced that, you would relate that to your children and your grandchildren. So I would think they would have heard and known about this, of course. So just things to think about, looking at their lives and their lifespans. This doesn't necessarily relate directly to our text that we're going to look at, but I just thought these were interesting things and it was something cool to look at and think about and just notice how much, especially with such a smaller population, how much they could have known about each other or been aware and even interacted with each other. So now, let's actually look at our text, Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 through 32, and I'm just gonna break this up as we go, try to keep it simple and just mention a few things as we go. So, starting here in verses 10 and 11, this is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad. Now, how was I saying that? Arphaxad, I think, is as close as I'll get. Arphaxad, 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. So again, and depending on your translation, they could be spelled slightly differently, and it could be Arpachshad. So a lot of these names are that way. I'll try to mention a few of them just for entertainment, but I can't pronounce any of them correctly, so it's okay. But again, notice here we're just told the first son's name, just like in the genealogies we've read before. But Shem, from what we see here, he had other sons and daughters. He probably had a lot of children. He had a long life. He had 600 years. Now, Arphaxad doesn't appear to have any special meaning. I looked that name up, couldn't find any special meaning for that. If we look at our next couple of verses, though, I do want us to notice that God remembers him and puts him in this account. He remembers him and mentions him, even if he doesn't mention anything that he ever accomplished other than having his son. And in these verses, Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Selah. After he begot Selah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Now, Selah and there's alternatives to his first name like Shalach, and I'm probably not putting enough spit into that, but Shalach, that's how it's kind of like that, okay? So that's another alternative you could see depending on your translation. But this whole idea that I was getting at with Arphaxad, it just shows that God doesn't forget us. Even if we think we're a minor character, a minor player in God's life here and his ministry that he gives us, even if we think we're not important, God doesn't forget about us. He remembers us. So Arphaxad is a part of the line of Abram and the line of Jesus. So we may not know much about him, but he had some important part to play. So sometimes that's how our lives are. We're not famous. We're not what we would consider to be big and important, but we still play some important part in God's plan and in his ministry. So now Jewish tradition, now this is not biblical, Jewish tradition says that Arphaxad was the father or source of the Chaldeans. Take that with a grain of salt, but I thought it was interesting just to mention that, because we're going to see where Abram and them came from over near the Chaldeans. So the next verses, 14 and 15, Selah lived 30 years and begot Eber. There is a variation on Eber that says Aver. I'm just going to stick with Eber. It's easier for me, and I kind of like Eber. Sounds good. After he begot Eber, Selah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Now, Selah, that name does mean weapon, and it seems to be associated with a spear, just so you know. Not sure of the significance of that, but I'll just mention that. Let's see. And then our next verses, 16 to 17. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg, our old buddy, Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Now, Eber comes from a word that means beyond, and from what I read, it's usually associated with east. It could be in relation to the fact that if you notice, they came off the ark over towards Turkey, and they seem to have drifted east, and then because Babel is south and east of there. Just a thought. May not mean anything significant, but just mentioning that. Peleg, of course, we recognize meaning division. And so this is the time of the tower and God scattering the people. But they continue from here, of course. If we look at the next verses, 18 and 19, Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Reu means friend or companion or neighbor, and it's meant in a good way. There are bad neighbors, but this means like a good neighbor, right? Like, what is it? State Farm, like a good neighbor. So it's kind of like a good neighbor like that. Possibly after the scattering, because this would have been after they had been spread out over the earth. Possibly after that, they felt that they needed their friends and neighbors more. And since they were in smaller groups, they needed each other more. They weren't They weren't one huge group anymore that all spoke the same language. So his name might signify that. Maybe they just like that name. But I just happen to think that might have been some meaning there like that, because we tend to name our children something meaningful, something that we think's meaningful and good. I know there are exceptions to that, but most people try to name their children something good, something meaningful, right? So like Peleg, even though it may not have been, depending on how they looked at it, it may not have been good, but Peleg means division, so it was meaningful. Okay. Next verses, Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug. After he begot Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Now, Serug, that name comes from a word that means knit together or weave or intertwine. That might make you think of community, of working together with others, and that may have been what they were thinking of, kind of like Reu, his friend and companion and neighbor, and here like a community. Just thinking maybe that was the kind of the way they were going with that. So it could signify that they're thinking of that as being an important thing, that they would be intertwined or woven together as a community. Then we look at verses 22 and 23. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. Now, Nahor kind of busts up my whole thinking. Now there is a variation of that that's Nachor instead of Nahor, but I'm just going to stick with what I have. But Nahor means snorer, someone who snores like me in a chair. This guy has too much hair, but still, basically same idea. That would be me. I'm just highly skilled. They could have named me that. That would have been good. I'm highly skilled at snoring and loud. But anyway, so this seems to imply, I don't know what, something annoying, or maybe Nahor really did snore as a baby. I don't know. Maybe that was just something funny. Like I said, there's exceptions to everything. So then we look at these verses here, or wait, was this this is the verses. Okay. So anyway, that breaks my idea of them naming their kids something meaningful, because to me that seems just silly. But I mean, would you name your kids Snorer or Snore? Probably not, right? But we see people do weird things. Anyway, so verses 24 and 25, Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. There is another version of Terah that is Terach, something like that, and it probably has a bit more spit to it. Terah is said to be, by one source, of unknown origin, but of another source I read that it means moon. And the idea was that he and his family worshiped some moon god, some moon idol. The Bible doesn't say that exactly, and I think this is the only time we're going to leave Genesis. If you are following, if you want to turn to Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, I believe this is our only verse out of here. So Joshua 24, verse 2, and of course, Joshua is gathering the tribes to Shechem and talking to them here. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods." So the point here to notice is that last thing that Joshua says, they served other gods. They served idols. Now, we're not told which idols, but they did serve idols. It's something to be aware of, and something we'll think about again here in a few minutes. We go back to Genesis chapter 11, and we look at verse 26 here. If we go back there, we'll see that Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Abram means High Father or Exalted Father, which is a good name for him, right? And then, of course, we have Nahor the Snorer. And I think it's funny that Terah named one of his sons the Snorer after his dad, but that's his choice, right? And then we have Haran. Haran means mountaineer, or we might say mountain man, that type of thing. Someone, dealing with the mountain. But these are the three sons at the end of this lineage that we're looking at here. Now, the next verses might seem a little bit redundant, but actually they're providing us a little more information, a few events of what's happening with the family. Genesis 11, verses 27 and 28. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. So first we see that Lot was born to Abram's brother. So Lot is Abram's nephew, which I think probably everybody knew that, but nonetheless. From what we see moving forward, Abram becomes kind of a figure father for Lot, and he watches over him. He has Lot with him until they both grow too large and they have to separate, if you remember that. And then he rescues Lot at one point in time when Lot is in trouble. And while it's not explicitly stated, Abram, like I said, seems to watch over him because he's his brother's son and his brother has died. So if we look here, this is a map that I borrowed. You can see Ur is down in that bottom right-hand corner near that number 1. Ur is down there. And that's where they were. And that is close to what I remember from other maps. If it's not in the land of the Chaldeans, it's very close, because I seem to remember the Chaldeans being in that general area to the east of Babylon there and stuff. So that's just what I remember from other maps. But this is supposed to, now there was... That's right. Now, there was some debate that maybe it could be in a little different location than this, but I didn't see, I don't know if it would make that much difference if it was a little further north over the river for us. So I don't think that would make much difference. So there's that. Then if we look at verses 29 and 30, then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. Now, some people say Sarai. I'm just going to stick with Sarah. That's just easier for me. And the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren. She had no child. Now, you might remember that Rebekah will come from Nahor and Milcah. She is Isaac's cousin. At this point, there's nothing wrong with that. The Lord eliminates that type of thing hundreds of years later in the law, but that's significantly later. Also notice that we're being told Sarah is unable to have children at this point. And as you know, that's a big part of what we're going to be studying and reading about in Abraham and Sarah's life to come in the next chapters. So that's going to play a big part of that. And I will just mention that, back then, it would not have been uncommon if a woman couldn't bear children for a man to dump that woman, to divorce that woman. Now, that sounds harsh. I'm just stating the way a lot of people did. However, you'll notice that Abraham stayed with her. He stayed with her all the way up. They had Isaac around 90. I forget exactly, but I think it's around 90, and we'll see that again when we get there. So he stayed with her regardless. So I just thought I would mention that. So, verse 31, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Now we see them move from down there in the bottom right, and they slide up. If you notice, they slide up to Haran up there at the number 2. You can see it up here. That's basically where Haran is. And that's where we're going to see Abram is called in the next chapter. Now, this does show a route and them going through Babylon. I'm not totally sure that Babylon was Babylon at that time. It may have still just been Babel. Babel was a big town, and it could just be they had good roads, and that's where they went through. I don't know. But so that route may or may not be exactly 100% right, but they did go to Haran, so that we know. All right. Then, if we look at our final verse for this chapter, so the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And this really completes our chapter. Terah dies in Haran. Lot is in Abram's care. And in closing, let's look at that with Joshua again. Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods." Again, they served other gods. They were idolaters before God called Abram. Now, if we look back at our chart and remember this, even with Noah and Shem possibly still alive, in the course of a few hundred years, these people had descended to idolatry. It may boggle your mind. It boggled my mind when I was looking at this and realizing that really in the course of just a short amount of time, these people had descended to idolatry, and they could have even known Shem and Noah, and yet they had descended to idolatry. And that's, again, boggles the mind. But godlessness, we see that godlessness continues to grow. Atheism and other forms of idolatry just become more and more the norm in our own world, in our own time. So there truly is nothing new under the sun in that sense. We, and when I say this we, I mean just people in general, like the population, tend to stray from the Lord and refuse to learn the lesson that we really need God. Without him, this world really descends into madness and evil, and we see a lot of that today. So in closing, this should remind us that God's grace comes to us before we ever act in faithfulness to him. Remember, Jesus died for us while we were enemies of God. And for a lot of us, I hope, he died before any of us were born, right? So that grace was there for us before we even were. And God gives us his grace before we even act in faithfulness to him to receive it. He sets it out for us. He offers it to us. So that grace always comes first, and we should thank the Lord for that, because without his grace and mercy, none of us would be here if he had not offered that to us. And this evening, if anyone here were to have a need for the prayers of the saints, or if anyone here, I think everyone here is a Christian, has been baptized, but if anyone needed to be baptized, felt for some reason that they needed that, I know Kim wanted to be sure, and she was baptized again. And if anyone were to have that feeling and want that reassurance, that would be perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and we would be willing to help you with that. Just if you need anything, just come forward and let us know as we stand and sing.